Making a video game is hard work. From the early concept stages all the way into development and marketing, bringing a game into existence can be an incredibly involved process. But what if the world and the characters have already been established? If you can secure the rights to an existing story and use that as the basis for your game, surely you can eliminate that part of the concept process and make the whole ordeal a little smoother, right? Yeah, maybe not. In truth, licensed movie tie-in games are not so easy to produce. Making a game based on a film can come with its own unique suite of difficulties and complications, and pretty infamously can lead to some not so great gaming experiences. But how long have they been around? How did they come into being? Did any of them turn out good? Join me as we answer all of these questions and more, and dive into the history of video games based on movies. Where better to start than at the very beginning? It was the 1970s, and arcades were starting to find their footing. But when 1975 rolled around, there was one piece of media on everyone's minds, and it wasn't a game, it was a movie.
It lives to kill. A mindless, eating machine. It will attack and devour.
That's right,
Anything.
Jaws. See it before you go swimming. Spielberg's nautical horror flick was massive, and Atari founder Nolan Bushnell saw dollar signs. Atari developed a game where you play as a deep-sea diver catching fish and avoiding a bloodthirsty shark. Bushnell attempted to secure the rights to make this an official Jaws game, but was ultimately unable to do so. That wouldn't stop Atari from cashing in on the trend, however. Shark Jaws released later in 1975, and let's just say its influences weren't exactly hard to discern. Hell, the flyer even tempts arcade owners with being able to cash in on the popularity, interest, and profits associated with sharks. If that's not on the nose, I don't know what is. So, while it's not officially licensed, Shark Jaws is probably the very first video game to be adapted from a movie. But what about licensed games? Death Race from 1976 was based on Death Race 2000, but again it wasn't officially licensed, so what was the first? In 1978, the world was treated to the first truly great superhero movie. Superman would lay the groundwork for the genre and become a huge hit in the process. Following the success of the film, Atari, being owned by the same parent company as DC Comics at the time, asked adventure programmer Warren Robinett to adapt Adventure into a game about the Man of Steel. 1979's Superman would eventually release, programmed by John Dunn using adventure code given to the project by Robinett. So this is technically the first licensed game released to tie in with a movie release, but it's based on the comics and not the film, so I still don't think this counts. There's also Star Trek Phaser Strike, which came out for the Microvision in 1979 and was meant to tie in to the first movie, but I still don't really count that, and it was released for the Microvision, which no one cares about, and it wasn't even called Star Trek later on, and you know what, enough of this. Let's get to the actual, real first game. In the early 80s, Yars' Revenge developer and all-around games industry legend Howard Scott Warshaw was interested in developing a movie-licensed game. He considered making arcade ports to be an exercise in futility, and thought a movie license had the potential to be a perfect middle ground between the structure of an arcade port and the freedom of making an original game. Sure enough, it wasn't long before he caught wind that Atari were looking for someone to make a game based on Steven Spielberg's 1981 adventure classic, Raiders of the Lost Ark. Warshaw jumped at the opportunity. He even met with Steven Spielberg, and over a game of Yars' Revenge, the gears were set in motion. Here it is, 1982's Raiders of the Lost Ark for the Atari 2600. No ifs, ands, or buts, this is the first true movie game. It's even got a little version of the theme song. Okay, so it's not great, but still. It's an interesting little adventure game. Howard has said that he wanted to make sure that the game reflected the unravelling puzzle at the core of the film, rather than being a straight action game. And it's a valiant effort. The puzzles are perhaps a little obtuse, but a lot of the film has been translated. It even got the blessing from Spielberg himself, who said watching gameplay was just like a movie. Spielberg even liked it so much that he enlisted Warshaw again to make a video game for his recently released blockbuster E.T., but we'll get to that in a moment. For now, let's take a look at the rest of what 1982 had to offer.
One of the traditional battlegrounds for the entertainment dollar has been here, the movie theater box office. The movies and the music industry have suddenly had to face a new competitor. Video game arcades around the country.
1982 was actually something of a big year for movie games. We got Alien, which is like a hybrid Pac-Man and Frogger clone based on the excellent sci-fi horror movie of the same name. We'd also see the first Star Wars game in the Parker Brothers adaptation of The Empire Strikes Back. This game recreates the opening of the film, seeing you playing as Luke Skywalker in his X-Wing taking down AT-AT walkers. It's not much to write home about, but something tells me this isn't the last we'll see of the galaxy far, far away. Feeling like something a little more spooky? Fret not. 1982 also saw the release of a few games based on horror movies. Firstly, there was Texas Chainsaw Massacre for the 2600, which sees you playing as Leatherface, tasked with killing as many trespassers as possible. It's not as scary as it sounds, trust me. There's also Poltergeist for Tandy's TRS-80 computer. In this one, you're trying to rescue young Carol Ann across 3 different gameplay styles as she's kidnapped by ghosts. Again, it's nothing I'd call essential playing. It's just weird to see films as dark and horrific as Poltergeist and Texas Chainsaw be rendered in pixelated 8-bit glory.
The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. After you stop screaming, you'll start talking about it.
There was also a Halloween game for the 2600 and... Yep, this one's also a 2600 game. Who'da thunk? But in all of these instances, it's clear that the technical limitations of the time didn't really give games the capacity to provide any genuine scares on par with the films that inspired them.
That'll keep them on their toes. Let's see what we can come up with next.
We're Atari. We have the vision, and we invented the technology to bring the excitement home to you.
Okay, we've put it off for long enough. Let's talk about the big alien elephant in the room. So much ink has been spilled about E.T. for the Atari 2600 that I don't know how much I can say that you haven't already heard. But it is still one of the most infamous movie games of all time, so I'll give you a quick rundown of what happened and we can move on. Continuing on from before, Howard Scott Warshaw, hot off the heels of his relatively successful Indiana Jones game, was tasked with adapting the summer blockbuster E.T. into a new game for the Atari 2600. But here's the catch. Warshaw was only given 5 weeks to complete the project, an absolutely meagre amount of time, especially in contrast to the comparatively cushy 10 months that it took to make Raiders. Howard still had some ambitious ideas, but ultimately the final game was confusing, unattractive, and did not gel with audiences. But, much like Raiders, E.T. also boasted a sparse rendition of the film's beloved theme. Look, I know they're not great. I just think there's a bit of a charm to these beepy-boopy renditions of recognisable movie themes that I just love. I can't help myself. Anyway, E.T.'s poor reception and sales are famously one of the major factors that led to the well-known video game crash of 1983. But let's not get into the weeds about that. There's plenty of excellent coverage of that whole situation all over YouTube. Apart from the crash, what else happened in 83?
Oh, Star Wars. It's great in the arcade. Whoa! TIE fighters! Fireballs! Coming right at me!
Oh, some game, huh?
Some game!
Well, remember when I said we'd be revisiting Star Wars soon enough? That's because I now get to cover what I still consider to be one of the best Star Wars games ever made. No, not you. Go away. Let's try that again. That's better. After the success of vector-based 3D tank game Battlezone, game designer Ed Rotberg was working on a successor, a sci-fi shooter to be called Warp Speed, which was actually modelled on a prototype wheel that was made for the fabled military version of Battlezone, but that's a story for another time. Rotberg left Atari not long after, but the game was left behind, and it wouldn't be long before Atari acquired a licensing agreement with Lucasfilm to make Star Wars games. Warp Speed was an obvious pick, and so it was given a fresh lick of paint, finished, and released as Star Wars in arcades in 1983, with both sit-down and upright versions available. The game takes place during the Battle of Yavin from the first movie, seeing you again playing as Luke Skywalker in his X-Wing, but this time you're taking out TIE fighters, conquering the fabled trench run, and finally blowing up the Death Star in a climactic ending sequence. There's digitized voices, lovely crisp vector graphics, and great retro game renditions of recognizable Star Wars music.
Remember, the Force will be with you always.
has so much charm and still plays great today. I'd recommend it to any fan of the franchise. The popularity of this game also meant that it would get an absolute shed-load of home ports. A wealth of consoles and computers would receive some version of this game. Everything from the Atari 2600, which I'm frankly bored of at this point, to the Commodore 64 and the Amiga, and even beloved British microcomputers like the ZX Spectrum and BBC Micro. They're mostly serviceable ports, but none quite recapture all the bells and whistles of the arcade original. On the whole, the medium of video games was blossoming around this time, and the subgenre of movie adaptations was doing so along with it. With the advent of the NES and more iconic summer blockbusters than ever before on the horizon, gamers were set to see an unprecedented amount of movie games hit store shelves. Join us next time when we dig deeper into the mid to late 80s and see how well our favourite 80s flicks translated to the 8-bit consoles and arcade cabinets of the time. Thanks for watching, it's been fun researching the history of this weird niche pocket of games history, and I'm looking forward to doing more of it. Also, should I have talked about Tron? It's such a weird edge case, I wasn't sure whether to bring it up or not. In any case, look forward to the next episode, or whatever else I decide to do next. See ya!